We're going to start off this evening with basically resting, which is good. And this is about experiencing, you know, the feeling, just simply being. And it's called resting in great placement. Martin used an example of placing something, you know, you just place it and it's just there. You don't need to move, you don't need to do anything. So we'll allow. This is something I've found so helpful because what it is really is connecting with our nature, allowing. We have an innate, compassionate responsiveness, allowing that. It's open. You don't have to change anything. It's already perfect. What's happening as we're resting, you can see, you can hear. Something unexpected happens. That's okay. There's movement, but there's stillness in the movement. thoughts come and go. You're resting, completely open. You can hear, you might even hear our daughter singing. She's in the shower. And that's okay. There's no agenda here. We're not trying to freeze the stillness, but allowing. Explain for a moment what's happening tonight. I'm really inspired by a verse that we say every morning in practice. And what the verse refers to is that all beings are temporarily confused. Or rather, it's referring to all temporarily confused beings. Not necessarily all beings are confused. There's some who are okay. So they may self-liberate in the basic open space of their nature. You know this self-liberation yourselves. Thoughts come and they go. But then it says, I should cultivate the bodhicitta. That's the open heart of resting in great placement. And it's quite amazing because in this resting, you're not trying to do anything. You're not trying to fix anything and not trying to change anything. And what we're actually tapping into, if you want to use that expression, what we're tapping into is our own natural, compassionate energy, our responsiveness. So thoughts, ideas, all kinds of things, complexities can arise in that space. But it's not confined, and self-liberation happens. They just go. And we don't need to do anything. And this knowing is really deep. It's kind of knowing. It's different from intellectual knowing. This is not something that somebody will tell you. This is like knowing in your own being. And in effect, you're accessing the openness, kindness, love, awareness, presence, your nature, allowing it find its voice, its expression. And that brings us into everyday life, because we sometimes think of meditation as being about stillness, not doing anything. And here, it's just that you don't have to do anything. But in everyday life, there are meals to cook, cabbage to cook. And things might seem complex, but when you allow this resting in great placement to happen in an everyday situation, you do your mise en place, or whatever they call it. You have things set out, complicated. I was cooking bacon and cabbage recently for my daughter and Martin as well. It's one of our family's favourite meals, and Anne brought the bacon over from Ireland, so it had to be special. So I'd lined up a whole pile of things that I wanted to cook, and I wanted to get it really nice. And I have all these stories in my head, some to do with my mother-in-law, but I don't need to go into those, about bacon and cabbage. And about my cooking bacon and cabbage and making a mess. But anyway, that's beside the point, you see, because when you're resting in great placement, you know what's to be done next. You go ahead and do it. Sure, thoughts come up. Oh, I'm cutting the cabbage the wrong size. You know, all of these stories, but they're just stories. They're not the essence. They're not the essence love that Sagni Rinpoche speaks of. They're not that. They're just extra. They're thinking of I. What will they think? It has reference points. Whereas with this, you set a timer. I mean, you're being sensible here, not blissed out. You're actually present, and you be there, one thing after another, letting it be, allowing. You can smell, you can taste, but like, essentially, you're just letting the cabbage cook. You're being with it. You're not in it. You're being with it. And a friend of ours who used to cook in France for the big retreats and that, and for the masters, we asked him what was the secret of good cooking. And he just said, love. So when you're, let's say, busy preparing a meal or doing anything that seems complicated, but you bring the resting in great placement, you allow that kind of presence. That's expressing your nature. It's an expression of love. We just rest again for a moment or two. I find it quite amazing because generally my mind, I have stories, I make things complicated, whereas this is very simple. And it's a question of really becoming familiar with this way of being. Because before this, the stories would have been uppermost, will they like it? Oh, she said such and such, the stories. But what I noticed too is the stories are always about me, about them. Whereas here, with just resting, there's no I. And without I, there's deep, deep confidence. Allow yourself to feel that. In fact, without I, the me, there's a different I, EYE. It's seeing. You see what's happening. You see yourself. You see other people. A writer referred to it as the patient eye of love, as it allows you to see the reality of the other. Now, I'd like to kind of engage with something for a bit, so if that's okay. And it's really about, it's a very important question that Maura asked. Is there ever a time when you need to reflect on a situation? Now, here, I think we're learning different ways of reflecting. And what's happening for me anyway, and probably for you as well, is you're finding you have more a reflective stance towards experience. And what I mean by that is you can be with something. You can be, formerly you would have been in a situation, maybe something happening, whether it's cooking a meal or with other people or whatever. And now you can be with that, but you're not in the situation, you're with it, not in it. And you can see you're present as it's happening. And with space as well, it's easier to see. And one piece of information that was very, very important for me, we've looked at and we've looked into how our own habitual tendencies, how they kind of drive us. But I hadn't realized until I came across this that other people have habits too. So I think what's happening, and those habits have come from the past, from their karmic experiences, from their relationships, early relationships particularly. And because it's come from their past, and it's not their fault, the phrase "they quite honestly arrived at" came up with someone writing about it. So what happens out of the habit is very often not intentional. You know, it surprised me that somebody would be reacting in a close situation, maybe combative or argumentative or whatever with me, and actually their reaction, how they are, how they conduct themselves in that interaction is coming from how they've learned to protect themselves or whatever in the past. And it mightn't be personal. It mightn't even be intentional, especially if it's a habit. So it's coming from their way of reacting to something that happened before. And instead, it's exactly the same as in our own case. Their reaction to whatever I'm doing or about to do or whatever is coming from the habits of mind that they have as well. So when you see that others are reacting in that kind of way, and when you really come to kind of know that that's what's happening for them, they're temporarily confused as well. And while there's that kind of understanding in terms of an intellectual understanding of what's going on, there's a deep kind of sadness that comes because you understand the suffering nature of what drives them to be like that now, and how that's just continuing the cycle of habitual reactions and more suffering in future. So this kind of reflective stance towards experience and having some of the information about why people are behaving in the way that they are, it gives you a bit of freedom and space. And what I find very interesting is with that space and understanding, there's actually more love, and there's less this tendency to take sides. And not seeing it so personally, it takes the sting out of it. It might actually be important for you to look at what it is that they're saying to you. There might be some truth in it. But they're either right or they're not. But you can look at it yourself and check and see, is my behavior a problem here? Is how I am a problem? And then it gives you the option to do something about it. So with practice, like with the resting in great placement, that allows you to see to hold everyone. There's like an embrace, there's room for everyone, including yourself. We're not excluding it yourself, including yourself. So that's in a practice kind of situation. Then in everyday life, it can be very difficult because the stories are so in your face and the behaviors are so in your face and they seem to be unchanging. Now, the thing about practice is we're not trying to change anything. Here, we're not trying to change anything either. What we're looking at, what changes, is our way of seeing. You know, instead of seeing it from the I perspective of me, you see it from the patient eye of love instead. There's openness and understanding. And I would think that because it's difficult to reflect on situations that are tough, and if we deliberately try to extract it or extricate a situation and examine it in detail, for me anyway, the stories come up. He said, she said, I should have. There's all this should be, if only. And I think the best thing you can do then, instead of going into the stories, is actually try some of the relative practices. They're using mind, yes, but the relative practices like Tanglen, like loving kindness, if you switch into that mode and just even very quickly in your own recollection of something, and sure, it's really worthwhile to spend time reflecting on a situation in the context of those practices. Does that make sense? Like I found that I had a particularly difficult situation at work, for example, and found it very difficult to face with somebody who had been a very good friend before. But to actually take time, not to engage necessarily, to just give yourself some space so you're not kind of faced with difficulty all the time, but to give yourself some space and just take time out, and with that specific situation or personal interaction in mind, is to really wish that ease come, and to do that, to do the compassion practices like Tonglen and love and kindness with that in mind. So you begin to see the other person's perspective as well. So this is really about, it takes time too, but it's a different way of seeing, I don't know whether that addresses your question a little bit more. It's probably a lot to take in, but do you have any questions now? Or would you like to talk later about it?
And we can do this on the Saturday afternoon, on Saturday after the sit as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I know Boris is something kind of special.
He has in the book club. I just to finish up, Martin, just to finish this kind of what we're talking about here, letting the cabbage cook, using the practices, how we are during our own practice, how we relate with how we relate with our own experience, having that reflective stance and that space and that understanding. It's really about having this, allowing this expression of love, because in that, all temporarily confused beings will self-liberate. Okay? So I've gone a tiny bit over time, but I'm very happy to hand over to Morris in the book club.